This is very exciting. Hi, I'm Dale Peterson, and welcome to the Unsolicited Response Show. My guest for this episode is Tom Ulrich. He is the principal consultant with Tom Ulrich, LLC. And I kind of known Tom for almost a decade, probably more, when he was writing long articles on NERC-CIP. He was kind of one of my NERC-CIP gurus. Yeah, he still is. Still all the ins and outs. When I said I'm going to step back from NERC-CIP, Tom and a few others were the people I relied on to tell me what's important. But then in recent years, Tom, you've kind of done that same deep dive, that same, really deep study, contribution, and articles on SBOMs. And you're the co-leader of the OWASP SBOM Forum. The trigger for this interview is you're the author of a new book, Introduction to SBOM and VEX. And just in the terms of full disclosure, you also have done some consulting with Fortress Information Security, who is a competitor in this area. So I just wanted, you mentioned that in the book. It's not a secret. Just wanted to put that out there. So with all that as an intro, Tom, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you. Glad to be here.
I think most of my audience knows what SBOM and VEX is, but I'm going to put a challenge to you here. Mm-hmm. Take 30 minutes, or not 30 minutes, 30 seconds. Take 30 seconds and describe what an SBOM is.
Well, yeah, the problem SBOM solves is the software you buy is really 90% of the software you buy, that is, of this code there, was not written by the supplier. If you buy from Microsoft, 90% of the code was not written by Microsoft, it was written by third parties. And you don't know what those third parties are. You don't know what kind of vulnerabilities apply to those components. And the SBOM tells you what the components are.
Right.
And
yeah.
And then the VEX tells you. Okay, go ahead.
That's fine. I think, I think a lot of people have called SBOMs kind of like a list of ingredients. They compare it to what you might see if you're in a grocery store and you're looking what's in this thing I buy. It's not the perfect analogy, but it tells them what is it's a software bill of materials telling what are the various open source third-party libraries and such that are in this. And then maybe do the same thing for VEX. What's the 30-second explanation for VEX?
Well, the use case I'm concerned with is basically, it's right on top of the SBOM. The problem with the SBOM, looking up the components in a database like the National Vulnerability Database, is that definitely over 95% of the vulnerabilities you find in the components are not actually exploitable in the product itself because of the way the component was installed. So if people get worried, let's say they find 20 vulnerabilities in the components in a product, because there are plenty of tools that look up those things for you, and 19 of those will be false positives. And so unless you know that, you're going to waste lots and lots of time pursuing these false positive vulnerabilities. You're going to call up the help desk and yell at them, when are you going to patch this? And they'll say, well, this is nothing you have to worry about. And so the VEX is supposed to try to cut that response off.
Yeah, and we'll talk a lot about the use cases and how they might be used and what the future might bring. Mm-hmm. But, it stands for Vulnerability Exploitability Exchange, VEX.
Well, it was one of those cases where the initials came first, and then the acronym came first. Literally, no. It was kind of free associating on vulnerability and exploitability, and then came to VEX, and then decided to figure out a way, some combination of words that would.
And it's a file that will just basically, for a vulnerability that would be one of those ingredients, tell you, does this vulnerability does it affect? Can it be exploited on the machine? Right. Can it be not exploited on the machine? And provides additional information. So the two work together. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to kind of set that up. Right. Most of our audience will know those, but we're going to kind of, as we dive into this, I wanted to start out with those definitions.
Okay,
Now, your
good.
book, um, first of all, congratulations on writing a book. Every author that ever comes on, I say that because it's not an easy thing.
No.
It's a lot of work for not a lot of reward in terms of dollars and cents, especially in this industry. So I really appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Thank you.
Who did you write this book for? Who should read this book?
Well, it's for anybody concerned about the security of the software they use. So now it's, I mean, it basically addresses both. What it's there for is there are two main use cases for SBOMs. One is the suppliers themselves, software suppliers.
Mm-hmm.
They use them to find out what vulnerability, they don't want to ship a product that's loaded with vulnerabilities. They want to, learn about them, and they need the SBOM to learn about all the vulnerabilities. That group, the suppliers are doing a very good job of that now. They're using them very heavily, and they're, removing a lot of vulnerabilities. So it's,
well, let's actually let's stay there because that
okay, go
was one
ahead.
of my questions. Let's
Okay.
look at the supplier case. Now, the book focused more on the end user case, which I think is the
Well, that's
more
it. Yeah.
interesting, difficult case, and we'll spend most of our time on
Yeah.
that. But the supplier case shouldn't be ignored. So you're saying right now suppliers are creating SBOMs, are tracking vulnerabilities
Oh, they are.
based on these SBOMs.
Yeah.
How are they creating them?
Well, there are various, there are all these tools that, if you have a modern build tool process, software build process, it literally is in many cases just a checkbox item. Do you want an SBOM with this? Every time you build the software, and now, the CI/CD pipelines that,
Mm-hmm.
that software suppliers use, where they're continually building the product all the time, and then finally they say, oh, well, this one's good, we'll ship that. But they're continually building it. Every time they do it, they just get an SBOM out, or they might even get multiple ones at different stages. So it's actually very easy, and it's almost always just kind of a checkbox item. Now, getting a good one is sometimes a problem. And often, and then there's this thing called the naming problem, which is the software has lots of different names, and software components have lots of different names, and it may be called something in your SBOM which is a name that you can't find in any vulnerability database anywhere because it's used another name, and so that's a big problem.
Well, let's stay on
Yeah.
the supplier side, though.
Okay.
You
Yeah. Well,
tried to make some estimates in the book. I like this. You tried to make some estimates as to, probably based on conversations that you've heard, where when a number of people that are really following this come up with similar numbers,
yeah.
it's not scientific, but it's at least a reasonable, educated guess in terms of the number of vendors that are using SBOMs. And I think you had some number like in 2017, it was like 35% or some number, and it was growing. But it appears to be, based on what you were writing, it appeared to me that more than half seem to be generating SBOMs these days.
Well,
Is that what you would think? Or I couldn't really get a 2024 number out of the book.
well, there's no way to really measure that. I mean, when you say a vendor, I mean, that might be Microsoft. It might be a little guy sitting in Germany writing code. So,
Yeah.
they're both vendors. And so, I mean, the numbers I get is from Steve Springett. Now you've interviewed him, and who is the leader of the Cyclone DX project, which is huge now. It's going all the time. And but he's also in fact, he has a tool called Dependency Track, which he developed more than 10 years ago and before there really was talk of SBOMs, but it took a manifest, which is kind of an SBOM from software development, and it looked up the vulnerabilities in it and in the components. And currently in fact, I quoted it, I mean, it's been growing exponentially, use of that. Currently, it's used 20 million times a day to look up component vulnerabilities. in the, from an SBOM. And this is
Mhm.
just one tool. And there are lots of other tools that do that too. Now, it's by far the most widely used, but the point is that Steve admits that almost all that use is by suppliers. It's not by end users. So the suppliers are using them fine. And, I mean, that's good because that means they're building much more secure software than they would otherwise. But the end users are not getting them and they're not using them.
Yeah. Now,
And,
one thing in your book that was interesting, and I guess I liked it because it agreed with something I've written. So it
okay.
must be right, if the two of us agree. But
Yeah, I don't
I've
know.
always thought one of the early wins here for SBOMs is that as an end user, we used to do this with security development life cycles. We would say, do you have an SDL? Can we see it? Can we see your threat model? Can we see your fuzzing efforts, and things like that? And not so
Mhm.
much that we really wanted to dig into them deep, but
You
we
just
could
want to see
just
them.
say this is a reasonable program that they have. So it's kind of the same way we can do that now with when we're going to buy equipment. We can go to the vendor. Do you have an SBOM? Let me see the SBOM. And you could actually say, I don't need a copy of it because they might freak out about that. But let me look at it. How old are the components in that SBOM? If I looked at two versions, are they updating the components between major releases and things like that? And one thing I want to point out for people who might read the book, on page 61, you have a list of about, I think it was like 9 questions that you can ask your vendors about their SBOMs. And I think that's really useful, certainly at the procurement process, but even on an ongoing basis, just so they're getting that customer pressure to do this. Did you have a favorite, one or two favorite questions you would ask? If you could, let's say, only ask your vendor 2 questions about the SBOMs, what would you ask them?
Number one, are they producing them? But
Well, that's a good
yeah,
one.
yeah. Um, I mean, the thing is, it is good to ask questions about SBOMs and kind of do this ad hoc stuff. But in my opinion, what really matters is automation. I mean, the idea of automate, SBOMs are, well, you can have non-machine readable SBOMs. You can put the same information in a PDF, and those are probably more widely used now than anything by end users. But you really want something that's machine readable, and when you get to VEX, it makes no sense at all without being machine readable. So you really, it does really have to be an automated. The whole idea is you're going to get an output from SBOMs and VEXs, and it's you don't need the SBOM, you don't need the VEX. What you need is the output, that you get, which is basically, and this is my opinion, is the real goal is to have a continually updated list of exploitable component vulnerabilities. Because those are the ones you need to go and start researching and bugging the supplier about and things like that. And that also helps you prioritize your patching, which is a big deal because most organizations nowadays are they've got a backlog of patches that would take them a decade to run out, and then they'll have another decade's worth. So they really need to prioritize. That's their biggest option, and that can help you do that too. But it really has to be machine readable, and it's got to feed into an automated process, and
I
that's
think
not
that's
there
key.
now. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, I think
Yeah.
that's key. And that's, it's funny because I actually had that written in my 30-second note that machine readable for automation purposes is really a key for this. Otherwise,
Yeah.
it's just doomed to failure. You did mention though, you said in your answer, you said, in my opinion, one of the things I found a little odd about the book, very honest, but a little odd, is there's many parts of the book in the author's opinion. The
Yeah.
author believes, I would say, boy, I'd hate to break it down, but I would think at least half is kind of your opinion or your analysis of what the situation is and where the world is going. Um, that do you, that struck me as just unusual. I don't see that in a lot of books.
Well,
That
how many
that it's
books
that
do you
sort of way.
read that are about a subject that's never been written about before, because this is the first book that's ever appeared on Amazon, as far as I know, that has software bill of materials or SBOM in the title. I mean, that's the problem. This is a brand new thing. Well, what's interesting is there's been so much written about it in the press and things, and yet it's never been put in a book. But having written the book, I can see why, because that's the problem. There's nothing, it's not like you have a Bible you can follow. You know, you have a bunch of documents, NTIA and then CISA documents, and the other people have written stuff. And I've got a lot of blog posts, but there's no sort of canonical set, and that's what I'm trying to do here. So, but I mean, the thing is there, and you know, just because CISA or, I mean, CISA doesn't say anything, NTIA doesn't say anything. All they've done is convened groups of people who say something, of, you know, developers and end users who say, well, this is a good idea, this is a good idea, this is a good idea, and they just write it down. I mean, there's no, it's not like you have some sort of corpus and say, well, this is how it has to be. No, it doesn't have to be anything. And so, you know, and again, you've got to just draw a line. And, you know, and that's still being done. In fact, that's one project we were just talking about in our SBOM forum meeting a little while ago. Well, you have to draw a line
Tom,
somewhere.
I think anyone who's read your stuff will appreciate the level of detail in it. And it was it was odd, but I also said it was odd, and it was also very Tom, because you were very clear when you were writing, this is what I believe to be fact. And this is, you know, for example, meetings happening, formatting information and things like that. And then it's the author's opinion. The author believes. That was really well marked out. And I mean, maybe more authors should do that, because I even looked at my own writing. I put a lot of my own opinions and analysis in there that are not factual. But one thing that was factual is you highlight the VEX specification program or problem. And this was kind of interesting. A complete surprise to me. We did the SBOM Pavilion at S4 in 2023.
Right.
And we wanted to include VEX in it. And we said INL, who created kind of the infrastructure, they created the tools to create the SBOMs and some VEX files. And the vendors were saying, well, what are you going to provide us? And INO really struggled with that in terms of, well, what are we going to provide as a VEX? And now I understand why they struggled so much, because
there's never been a specification.
Why is that? I mean, I look at the description of it. It does not seem like it would be that hard to specify.
Well,
what's stopping the specification?
Yeah. Well, there have been two, and originally there was just one format one platform on which you could produce a VEX. And that was the CSAF, which is an OASIS project. You know, was cybersecurity advisory format, I guess.
It seems to be a little more popular in Europe. I hear a lot of especially the Germans, really promoting CSAF.
It's popular with big companies, but so when we did it, you know, and I was involved. In fact, I drafted the only document that the NTIA ever published on VEX, which it was 1 page long. And what we did it for CSAF so they could understand what VEX was. But they put out this little spec, which just basically kind of listed the fields, but they left out the most important part, which I didn't realize till later, is that CSAF. I mean, if you look at their spec for CSAF format itself, which is used for all sorts of vulnerability notifications, not just VEX. It's like 100. It's probably 100 pages. There are no page numbers, but a very small type. It is a bear, and there's one command that's required, or one field, I guess, or it's really a couple fields, but that's required in every VEX document, and they left it out in the spec, in the fields, you know, the fields for VEX, and we all just kind of accepted that. But you know, but when you try to create it, you've got to use this product tree, what's called the product tree, and there are a million options for that. I mean, this specifying the product tree, it goes on for like 20 pages in that 100-page document for CSAF. It's about 20 pages, and it has a million options, and it's very small type, and it would take you, weeks, months to understand that, and you probably might not ever do it. And so that's the problem.
Yeah, but what about Cyclone? Cyclone DX seems to be much more,
it's much more, it's much,
things move faster there. Why isn't there a Cyclone DX VEX format?
There should be. Well, there is now, because the OS SBOM forum, we created what we call tight specs. Because the problem is, unless for a consumption tool, it has to know exactly what it's going to consume.
Sure.
Otherwise the number of use cases literally grows, actually not just exponentially, as the factorial of the number of options. And so you can easily get, if you've got like 20 different independent options in that one product tree field, which I'm sure there are, that translates into 2.4 quadrillion options. and the end the consumption product would have to be able to understand each of those 2.4 quadrillion options. Now, my guess is there aren't too many developers who are going to undertake a project where they have to deal with 2.4 quadrillion use cases, and that's the problem. It has to be just tightly specced out.
Yeah.
And that's what we did in the SBOM forum.
So you're saying that your book is already out of date? There is a VEX specification now?
Yeah, we just did it. Now okay. But it's for this very narrow use case. Now there's several other VEX use cases that are different. Like Red Hat has one, Cisco has one. They're kind of pretty much similar. Yeah. Now they're both like, Omar Santos from Cisco is the chairman of the CSAF working group, CSAC group, and Pete Allure from Red Hat is on the board of CSAF. Mm-hmm. So they're very tight with CSAF. But they, the problem is that you have big companies like Oracle, Red Hat, mm-hmm. Cisco, Microsoft, Schneider Electric that develop they put lots of time into creating the VEX, or into creating CSAF documents, because they've got people who can really spend full time doing it. But the end users, you ask them, what tools do the end users use? There are no tools currently, and that's why we're developing code for them that can ingest a CSAF document. In fact, there's no simple parser just to say in English, this is what the CSAF document says. There's nothing like that.
Yeah, and I think that I want to talk about service providers as kind of at least an interim solution. I think that's going to be where the market will end up. We might differ on that. Just to kind of highlight this, you said on page 15, and I think almost the exact same sentence in multiple places, just to highlight how much you think VEX are important. It says, the author believes that SBOMs will not be distributed to end users in any meaningful way until current confusion over VEX can be resolved.
Yeah, it's a showstopper problem.
Showstopper problem.
Yeah. Okay. And it's the only real showstopper that I can see. But
okay. Yeah. Well, here might be another showstopper.
Okay.
Do asset owners, I deal mainly in the OT world, as you know, do asset owners in the OT world want SBOM and VEX?
Well, the thing is, they don't need them. They don't know. In fact, Steve says that, I don't know whether he's done it with you, but when he gets interviewed, they often ask him, you're not going to ask stupid questions like this. Well, where do you see SBOM and VEX in the next 10 years? But anyway, when he gets asked that question, he says, well, I hope they're not needed, because that's the point. Nobody needs an SBOM. Nobody needs a VEX. What they need is the information they convey.
Right.
And really what I'm thinking now is you're saying it'd be service providers. In my book, that's what I pretty much say. It's good. The service providers are going to do it. I don't think there will be end user tools really that, that'll be commercially supported, low cost, perhaps ever, for end users. But there will be, I said in the book that, the key will be a bunch of service providers who will cobble together all this open source stuff, which they can make work. But big companies, who are, their business is insurance, their business is not, creating, open source tool chains that they can read VEXs, so they just want to have, they want one throat to choke. If they have a problem, they want to find, get an answer, and, they don't want to have to submit it to some open source committee. So they're not going to, they're never going to be satisfied with, with anything other than real commercial support. And I don't think there will be. So, but, service providers can devote the time that's needed to do that sort of stuff. But now I'm beginning to think really it's the suppliers themselves who will really do this, because they should be doing it anyway. They should obviously they are creating SBOMs now. They are looking up vulnerabilities. Well, why don't they just, and they're the ones who determine whether the vulnerability is exploitable or not. So they do the VEXs. Why not just share that information with all their users?
Well,
and,
so we're getting, I think there's some answers to that, but when you think about it, they're already dealing with a huge patching problem. They're not a huge patching problem. They have a large number of patches to deploy. Most asset owners I see are, let's say, not doing real well in deploying the ones that they already know about, let alone multiply it by 50 or 100 or whatever number you want to say.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is, they seem very comfortable relying on the vendor to tell them what to patch. I don't see a lot of them saying, I don't trust you. You're hiding things from me. So why wouldn't you just have a machine readable feed that goes into, let's say, a vulnerability management system that just says, I have this product. Here's what you need to patch. I don't care about all these VEXs that tell me something's not affected. I don't care that there's 10,000. Tell me about the 90 I need to patch. And I really don't want to know anything else. Why would end users ever want this stuff?
No, I mean, that's the point. They will, well, they need to know the vulnerabilities anyway, not just apply patch 1, apply patch 2, apply patch 3, but, they need to know the vulnerabilities, because there might be different ways they can deal with them. But
they need to know the exploitable vulnerability.
The exploitable, yeah. But that's actually not a big number. That's the point. And it's really more than 95% that are not exploitable. It's probably like 97 and 98%. And when you think about it, that is, of every 40 vulnerabilities you discover in components, only one is probably exploitable. And so, it won't be that many. And of course, the ones, you have these component vulnerabilities like the log4j, OpenSSL, and, Apache struts, which was behind the Equifax breach. Those are all component vulnerabilities, and you really want to know about those. But you're right. I mean, it is really patch prioritization, which is probably the main benefit of all this. But the thing is, the whole idea of the transparency is, Veracode did a study like in 2017, and they asked suppliers, are you patching component vulnerabilities? And it was only like 20% even looked at them, even looked at the component vulnerabilities, let alone patch them. So now that was in 2017. Now, hopefully I'm sure it's much higher percentage now, but I mean, that's the problem, that to be quite honest, the suppliers can't be trusted to, with their own code. Well, even their own code is a problem. They need to report. People don't realize. They think, oh, well, the vulnerabilities are in the database there because people blew the whistle on the supplier. No, 99% of the components of the CVEs that are out there were reported by the supplier themselves. They're blowing the whistle on themselves, and that's the point. But they have to report them, and that's a big point I made in the book that, if the supplier doesn't report the vulnerabilities, they're going to look fine in the NVD because there won't be any vulnerabilities from. Wow, boy, they're great. But actually, there's an anecdote, and I know I have in the book that from Tom Pace. I don't know whether you know.
Yeah, with NetRise.
Yeah, NetRise, right? Yeah, he's an interesting guy. But he, and this kind of got us going really. Early in the SBOM forum in 2022, he talked to us. He described a device that, well, is a maker of networking devices that are used in critical infrastructure in the military, and this vendor, and they're a small one, not Cisco, and they only, they have like about 50 different devices. They've never reported a single vulnerability in any of their devices, and he analyzed the firmware in one of their devices and knew about vulnerable components in that firmware, and he said that there were at least 40,000 unpatched vulnerabilities in that one device, in the firmware in that one device. Okay, but they've never reported a vulnerability, and so that's the problem. Device makers are not reporting vulnerabilities. I looked at the top 10 medical devices, not very important, just medical devices, keeps you alive and stuff, frou like that. And I looked at them, yeah, and you can look up. They don't, if you look them up in the NVD, there will be a CPE number if they've ever reported a single vulnerability. There are 5 of those top 10 medical device makers have obviously never reported a single vulnerability to CVE, and 3 of those remaining 5 have just reported like a few, when they've got hundreds or thousands of devices, and they've only reported a few vulnerabilities. And the other 2 were just these huge ones. Siemens was one, I forget, where you don't know whether it's medical devices or anything else, so you can't really tell what it's about.
Yeah.
But the point is, device makers in general, now there are some big exceptions like Cisco and Schneider Electric are 2 that really are exceptions, but in general, device makers are not reporting vulnerabilities at all, and that's a huge problem.
Well, I mean, we could go down the vulnerability disclosure rabbit hole.
Well, I know. Well, but see, that's the thing.
And the book does cover that, but I think,
well, you've got to, for SBOMs, you have to, that's the thing. If you're using SBOMs for vulnerability management, which is what I'm doing, you have to, you have to ultimately look at, well, are vulnerabilities being reported in the first place? I mean, otherwise it's kind of a waste of time.
Yeah, but you kind of give the vendors a break a few times. Like on page 114, you said basically to avoid ridicule or outrage from old vulnerable components, you said, quote, a supplier should not feel obligated to list every component they know of in their SBOM.
No, they shouldn't.
And end users should not press the suppliers to do so.
Not now.
So that's kind of like, well, you could just remove the really bad stuff.
Well, I mean, unfortunately, right now, they're not being distributed at all to end users. SBOMs are not. So, I mean, and one of the reasons is that suppliers are, their lawyers are saying, no, and you're not going to release that because we're going to get sued for, these products. Often, the thing is, old components are often there. Every product has old components, and some of them, the bigger and more complex the product is, the more old components are there, because there's something they're all kind of interlocked. And if you try to replace one component, you're going to have to replace 100 or 200, and it's very, very, because they're all, they all rely on each other. And so it's a huge job to replace a component. So what they do need to do is do what they call backporting packages. I'm sure where they go, there are big vulnerabilities that come out, and even though the product might be way out of support, they will patch the big vulnerabilities rather than, let those out of support users fall victim to whatever it is, like WannaCry, there was, that was the situation there. And so there are responsible practices you can provide, but the thing is that that's not going to show up in the SBOM. All you're going to see is all these old components, and people are going to yell at you. So I don't mind if they don't include all their own components. Right now, the alternatives, they're not going to provide the damn thing at all. So that's the problem. We have to start somewhere, and I'm actually proposing now that I don't think SBOMs are going to be used at all until we've had like 2 or 3 years of experience where basically everyone agrees this is just a proof of concept. We're doing it just for fun. We're not going to use it to, at least the end users say, well, we're not going to use it to make business decisions. And then, so the lawyers then and the suppliers might say, oh, well, okay, well, then maybe we can let this go out because we can't get sued.
Okay. Well, let's jump to another. Yeah, let's jump to another one. Like on pages 158 and 163, you talk about compensating controls, and you even give the example of a firewall rule that prevents the device or app, the vulnerability from being exploited.
Right.
You could have a firewall rule, and that this could allow a vendor to say not affected or not exploitable. This seems like a huge hole because, I mean, I think back to 2012 in the ICS, the reaction from most ICS vendors was, oh, that vulnerability isn't an issue because the bad guys shouldn't be able to get there.
Well, I don't advocate doing that either. I think it's much better if they don't say anything at all. If they need to list the component and they just put no assertion in there in SPDX or I forget what the term is in Cyclone DX, where you say, there's a component there, maybe we don't know the name, maybe we're not going to tell you, tough luck, but there's a component there, we're not going to tell you, move on, The problem is right now the alternative is no SBOM at all. So is it better to have a glass half full or a glass that's completely empty? I mean, that's really what the choice is right now. Maybe in 5 years or 10 years, it will be different,
Let's circle back then just to close one thing, and then we'll talk about service providers.
Yeah.
So we've had this discussion about where we are now and some of the exceptions and such.
Mm-hmm.
But in the book, you are a very strong proponent that the suppliers should provide a VEX even if it's not affected. So you said about 90% of the vulnerabilities in the components would be not exploitable or not affected.
Well, that was the reason for VEX because there's 95% or more are not exploitable, and you don't want the end users getting all worried about them and swamping your help desk. That was the main use case for VEX initially, is to keep the help desk from being swamped right after an SBOM was released and people panicked about all these non-exploitable vulnerabilities. So that was actually the main original use case.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'm less excited about VEX, and I kind of go back to this idea of, if I'm an asset owner, I just want you to tell me what I should patch. And
now the thing is, I mean, you're not an exploitable vulnerability. For one thing, it's not even going to appear. You won't know about an exploitable vulnerability until the supplier reports it, and the supplier is never going to report it. Well, if they're a device supplier, they're never going to report the thing because hardly anyone does. But even if they're a software supplier like Oracle, they're not going to, very responsible software supplier, they're not going to report it until they have a patch. And so it's no longer really an exploitable vulnerability because there's a patch available, and so but you still want to get it out that the vulnerability is exploitable, because you want people to know, if in case they didn't see the patch notification, look, there's a patch out. This is a bad vulnerability. You need to do something about it. And
you definitely want to avoid the silent fix. We saw that for years, where the new version would come out and it would fix some very important things, but they didn't include that in the notes. So the asset owner would say, well, I don't need this new feature, I'm not going to deploy it, not realizing there were some important security patches. Okay, let's finish up here with, and to me, this is the most interesting part of the whole SBOM marketplace, is how whatever set. Now, you and I might disagree on the set of information
No, we
asset
never
owners would
disagreed,
want.
Dale. Okay, go ahead.
But there's going to be some set of information that's going to be useful for asset owners related to component patching. And if I'm an asset owner, I don't want to go to my 20 or 50 vendors and try to bring all that in and deal with that myself. And I think if I'm a vendor, I don't necessarily, unless I'm just a huge vendor and can create a company to do this, I don't want tens of thousands of customers coming at me with unique requests. I'd rather, I've said this in a few shows where I see there's this big cloud on one side, which is the vendors, and there's this even huge, 10 or 100 or 1,000x cloud on the other side being the asset owners, the end users. And I see there being these service providers in the middle mediating that information between the two. And I sort of got in your book that you feel at least that's going to be the first way it's going to happen. Maybe at some point end users are going to have tools, but you see, is that where you are too, that you see these service providers being the shorter term win, whether that's 2 years, 5 years or whatever?
Yeah, but I think really, it really should be suppliers, because they have all that information already. All they have to do is share it, and maybe reformat it a little. But they know about which vulnerabilities are exploitable. They can just feed that information to their end users. And so then the users don't need SBOMs or VEX, and even these third-party suppliers don't. Now, the problem is these third-party vendors that not every supplier is going to do that, because they'll have to have certain tooling and stuff to do that. But they should have that tooling now just to deal with the problem with component vulnerabilities. So I really think it should be them that they just feed that out. And I think it will be, I say in the book that I think the suppliers are going to take responsibility. And I use the example of patching, where they first, the suppliers started charging for security patches, that you would have to get maintenance, and you couldn't get security patches unless you paid for maintenance. Now that was a really self-defeating, and people realized how terrible that is. Oh, well, because there's a herd immunity thing. And if you have all these people who don't have patches because they don't want to buy maintenance, then it's hurting everybody, who has that software. So, and that that message got pretty quickly learned. And after a while, you just expect if you buy any software that you're going to get patches with it. And I think this is going to be the same with SBOMs.
Well, but imagine I'm an asset owner. I'm a manufacturer, and I have different DCSs in different plants around the world. And then I've got all sorts of other systems. I've got my OPC server. I've got my network components. I have all this stuff. I basically want to know here's my asset inventory. So they are pushing to have asset inventories. We've seen that in the OT space, to develop asset inventories. And then they would want to be able to go out and say, I have product or application X version 2.6. What do I need to patch? Or what vulnerabilities do I have? And then I'll make the determination whether I need to patch it or not. Because you might not apply all patches. You might only apply 10% of the patches because you have your own risk management thing. But I guess what I'd worry about, you say the suppliers should do this. I worry, and maybe this is where the protocol comes in. I worry if I go to Schneider Electric and I get one thing, and then I go to my OPC vendor and I get another thing, and I go to Historian and I get a third thing, and I've got to figure out how do I interface all that. I think if I'm an asset owner, it's very appealing to me if I can go to one place and send them my product name and my version, and they can come back and say, this is the status. And I can do that monthly, or if I want to, I can ping that thing daily. I see real value in that as an asset owner.
Yeah, you mean in terms of knowing what patches are available for that product and version, right?
In terms of only having to go to one place to go to a service provider, as
Aren't there
opposed to trying to establish and maintain all the different connectivity options
aren't there
that are
service
there.
providers like that who do that? No, I mean I would think that's not
Not an OT. I mean,
not
the
noisy.
closest might be FoxGuard. FoxGuard does
Oh
that
yeah,
for
okay.
a few systems. They'll do that. I think they did that for like the GE Mark 6 and a few
Oh
other
yeah,
things.
right.
But I could see real value in that. And then you talk about in the book, who's going to pay for this? You can see this. You can see so many payment models. For example, a Schneider Electric could say it's going to cost me so much money to service my customers. And as you said, this is something that isn't considered something I can charge them for. So maybe I just pass this whole responsibility to a third party. Or maybe if
Well,
I'm
you
Schneider
pass it.
Electric, I'm big enough to create my own company to do this. But
Well, they
I
can do
could
that.
see
Yeah,
them paying that. Or
they
I
would
could
have
see
to
this,
pay it, but as long as the supplier pays it, you know, I
or,
not only
well,
think I think they should. Well, they introduced the components. I mean,
but
that's the problem.
couldn't
They're
you make it?
the source of the problem. So they ought to be taking ownership of the fixing the problem.
Well, should doesn't really matter in business, I don't think.
Well, but I also made in there the point that I think just like in patching, it was the suppliers inevitably started bearing the cost. Now, but I also made in there, I point out lesson I learned from Milton Friedman when I was
Yep.
taking his economics courses a few years ago, I will say, and he said you have to distinguish between the person who pays the cost in the economic sense and the one who writes the check, and they're often very different, And then he's usually talking about taxes, where
Yep.
the incidence of the tax, the effect falls on someone who may not be the person who pays the tax, and so just like you have a house, when you buy a house, he said no one should complain about property taxes because they don't pay them. They write the check, but when you bought the house, the property owner and the property owner knew there were going to be taxes to be paid, and that had to be factored into the, given it was competition, it had to be factored into the price of the house. And so you've already, the person you bought it from paid the tax. Now that's kind of cold comfort. But anyway, I mean, that's the idea. So, and in this case, I think in every, I do think this falls on the both in terms of moral obligation and in terms of actual economic, impact. It's going to fall on the supplier, and it should,
Well,
But
it should, but I could easily see a business case where, well, let me get to this in a question. So
okay, well,
how
go ahead.
we've got some customer, or we've got some vendors in this space. So Fortress Information Security, who you worked with, Adolis, Finite State, NetRise, are sort of in this supply chain or SBOM
Mhm.
world.
Right.
How are they going to survive until this market
They
becomes
seem to
a
be surviving pretty
reality?
well. Well, they've got lots of venture capital, I guess. But um, I'm not too worried about them. No, I mean the problem is it's a very small market now because their SBOMs are not being distributed to end users. Now companies like well, there's Cydeats and Cydelum and all these companies you may not have heard of, but they work primarily with vendors. They're doing very well. I'm not whether they're making money, in an operational sense, I'm not sure, but they're and but for these third party service providers I'm looking for the end user space, they're not there yet, and that's I was kind of hoping they might start appearing, and that's why we're going to do a full scale proof of concept. The SBOM Forum will lead one hopefully later this year, and where we're going to have to create some third party service providers if there aren't any, because and it's not going to be very hard either, but
Yeah.
that's there is some. I agree. It's a question of whether they're going to be rising. But as far as the suppliers go, you know they're not going to be put out of business by producing SBOMs because they're doing them now anyway. So
Well, yeah, I'm not worried about the suppliers. I'm just
okay,
thinking these small companies, and I keep
yeah,
waiting for one of them to really kind of they have to. A lot of them are creating custom SBOMs for not custom, but creating SBOMs for legacy products. They have
oh
the
yeah,
ability to pull things apart, and they're charging money for this, either for the asset owner or sometimes for the vendor who's
yeah.
under pressure from an asset owner to do it. So that's kind of how they're paying the bills. But I could see some of them trying to be this service provider marketplace, especially. I think a key to that will be looking to see if they get investments. So, for example, if Siemens made a sizable investment, a VC investment in one of these, and said, "We're
Hmm.
going to allow you to be our portal for this sort of thing on a like a pilot project." To me, I'm watching for that. I'm surprised we haven't seen it yet. Like you, I would expect some service provider to appear in 2024.
Oh, I do. Yeah. In fact, I'm I'm hammering on those companies too to do it.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Okay.
so no, I agree. It's going to have to happen. But as I said, I think ultimately it may be the suppliers themselves which are going to be the service providers, at
Yeah,
least in
that's certainly one model, and
yeah, right.
maybe even that's the
Well, it's
short
going to
term
be
model.
mixed. Yeah, yeah. But no, I agree. It's not a market failing because there's no market currently. They're not and it is kind of a chicken and egg problem, and
Yep.
that's why we're hoping to kind of jumpstart it with the proof of concept. By the way, we're working with now. Do you well, okay, anyway. Do you know who Sonotype is? Or
Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean,
yeah.
yeah, I mean they're the big dog in the uh, the software composition analysis space, but
Yep.
which is SBOMs, and they've
Yep.
been doing it for years, and but I think they will participate in this. So they may very well create these tools themselves.
Yeah.
Um, but
Okay.
yeah,
Well,
no,
let's
I'm
finish
optimistic.
up.
Yeah, go
Well, I
ahead.
got one last question for you, and
Okay, fine.
couldn't, it's an area that I've just read about in the last couple of weeks, and I don't have any insight on what's going on with the NVD, the National
Ah,
Vulnerability Database. Do you have any insight as to what's happening there?
well, it all no. I mean, there was something that happened. I do have an idea. It's been talked about, but the point is that, and in fact, that today is 2 months from the day their output suddenly dropped, and we have yet to have an explanation of that. Nor do we have any idea of what the fix will be. And the only thing they've said, and Tanya Brewer, the head of the NDD, well, the NVD is part of NIST, and so she's a NIST employee, but she's
Yeah.
in charge of the NVD group there, and it's only about 20 people. It's not a very big group. Um, she's announced that there's going to be a consortium. Now that was something she dreamed up when we approached her at the
Yeah.
beginning of last year. The SBOM forum did, OWASP SBOM forum, and we talked. She came and talked to us a couple of times, and during that our first talk, she got the idea. Well, maybe we need to put together a public-private partnership, and she came up with talk to the lawyers there, and they have these things, and so she wants to put together this consortium. Well, and then she and she said, well, it's going to be announced in the Federal Register, next month, and and then so we'll get going very soon. And then she just disappeared, and we didn't hear any more about that. And then all of a sudden it gets revived now when this problem happens, and they put it on the only thing I can say is that, well, we're going to put together this consortium to solve the problem. Well, the consortium will not be in place before 9 months at the earliest, and it may very well be years. And then they got to deal with the problem. The problem with the NVD is it's an ancient infrastructure. It's written
Yeah.
in these languages. I mean, it's 20 years old, more than 20 years. And she wanted to, she said she wanted help in, people to commit to spend 6 months at a time at a minimum helping them with their coding problems, then they would have to spend 2 or 3 months learning this ancient language that no one uses anymore. And that's a good career move if I ever heard one. And so, that's the problem. It's a creaky old infrastructure. There's all sorts of non-redundancy, which obviously is the case since they're still having problems 2 months after this incident. So, but the interesting thing is the CVE.org, has all the data. The data in the MVD all comes from, most of it comes from CVE.org. And that database is much more modern. It's sitting there. It can be used now, like Oracle's already moved over to using that instead of the MVD. And, let's just make that the database. Then the MVD can still create stuff, to create information which is what they're doing now. And it can be added to the CVE.org database rather than have CVE right now. All their information, even though they're the source of obviously all the vulnerability information, it goes into the NVD, and they would just keep that information, and NVD would add whatever they wanted to add to it. But it makes no sense to try to. I mean, the NVD isn't going to go away. It can stay there. It's got all this data. There's no point in throwing away, and so it can still be used. But let's make the investment in CVE.org. And the problem solved. Now the problem, then it's no longer a technical problem; it's a political problem because you have two different departments. NVD is Department of Commerce, and CVE.org is part of DHS. So that's the problem. But there's no.
And I will say that in your book, Tom Ulrich's book, let me make sure I get the title right: Introduction to SBOM and VEX.
Thank you.
You do talk about this consortium and some guidelines as to how it should be created, and you talk about it being a global consortium and a variety of other things.
That's not the NVD. Yeah, no. Ultimately, there needs to be global vulnerability days.
Yeah,
right. In fact, we're
but there's really a long, I think it's like 10, 15 pages in the book on what it should be, as a classic Tom Ulrich description. Very, very detailed. Tom, I really appreciate you being on the show. We're coming up on an hour here. I guess as a finish, where should people buy your? I know I bought the Kindle version on Amazon, but do you have a place where you'd like people to buy Introduction to SBOM and VEX? Is there a place where you get more money?
The only place it's available is Amazon.
Amazon.com.
I self-published on Amazon. No, actually, Amazon has people who self-publish there get actually very good revenues. I mean, very good percentages, for it.
Okay.
So they've done a good job.
I bought the Kindle copy. Very, very readable in Kindle. I'm sure the hard copy is nice as well. And then in terms of someone wants to reach out with you, let's say they read the book and they have some feedback. Where are you most active? Is it LinkedIn? That's where I see you, but is that where you're most active?
Yeah, you can reach me on LinkedIn, and you can send me an email.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I mean, anybody who wants to join the SBOM forum is welcome to do it. They just send me an email, and I'll put them on the list.
And you also write an article every week, right? Is it just one a week, or how often are you writing?
It's usually two. I'm still writing on, NERC-CIP, of course, and especially with the cloud problem. We could have a whole interview on that. That's a big issue now. So because I am doing work with one of the big CSPs on that.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I'm still writing.
And we'll put a link to your articles in the show notes. Tom, thank you very much for being on the show. Congratulations on getting the book out, and I hope you get a lot of readers of this book.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dale. I appreciate the invitation to join you.